In the outskirts of Georgia, far from the glamorous urban centers, there lies a small town called Hollow Creek, where the roads twist endlessly to nowhere, and where time seems to run one beat slower than the rest of America. Just like the high school at the heart of the town, Hollow Creek High, a dreary public school with broken trees, moss-covered fields, and walls stained thick with graffiti. And there, one thing every teacher who ever stepped foot in the place remembered vividly: Classroom 8C. Not every class gets a nickname, but 8C did. It was called many things: the Soul Trap, Gettysburg 2, the place where teachers go to die, depending on who you asked in the faculty lounge. Some whispered about it like an urban legend for rookie teachers. Others, especially those who had already quit, said it outright: 8C is unteachable. It's a lawless zone. Whether you taught math, history, or literature, being assigned to 8C meant you were sent into battle, with no weapons, no allies, and only the cold stares of kids who didn't believe in any adult walking through the door. That grim tradition had continued for 7 years, until one Monday morning when a new name appeared on the official staff roster, a name nobody, from the principal to the school board to the tenured teachers, believed would last a week. That name, Imani Bell. She didn't arrive in a shiny SUV like other teachers, nor in a beat-up Camry with an education sticker on the back windshield. She stepped off a residential bus route, the same one used daily by most of Hollow Creek's black students. It was a chilly morning, the sky overcast and the ground still damp from the night's rain. The bus gave a soft hiss as it pulled away, leaving behind the petite but upright figure of a woman who stood in the middle of the schoolyard as if she had always belonged there. Imani didn't wear anything flashy or trendy: a navy blue suit, a white high-collared blouse, simple flats, clean and understated. Everything about her radiated calm strength. Her curly hair was neatly pinned at the nape, her face lightly made up, her eyes carrying a gentle but alert gaze. She held a document bag in one hand and walked steadily across the yard, where the old trees cast shadows on cracked bricks. Each of her steps made a soft, deliberate thud, steady and composed, even though the concrete beneath had long since chipped and crumbled. She didn't know, or maybe she did and simply didn't care, that from an upper floor, a student was already filming her entrance. A short clip was uploaded to TikTok less than 5 minutes later, captioned simply, "New blood, won't last a week." Views surged within hours, with comment sections filled with laughing emojis and smug smirks. Room 8C didn't just exist in reality, it had become digital legend. Outside the principal's office, a group of students loitered under a gnarled oak. They stared at her, whispering with expressions that mixed curiosity and contempt. A white boy with blonde hair muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "She's the first black teacher I've seen here." Another snorted, "Bet she doesn't make it past Friday." Even the old gatekeeper, Mr. Henry, who had worked at the school for over 30 years, watched her with a quiet, sympathetic look. Farther off, 2 senior teachers, Ms. Franks from history and Mr. Monroe from chemistry, stood near the vending machine. They stopped talking as they saw Imani. Ms. Franks whispered, "That's Ms. Bell, right? Heard she's from New Orleans, used to teach at some arts academy." Mr. Monroe shrugged with a sarcastic tone. "Doesn't matter how good she is. You can't change 8C's DNA. Not white and way too young." They didn't laugh, but the skepticism showed. Imani reached a silver-painted door, the paint mostly peeled. The sign above it read, 8C Language Arts. She placed her hand on the handle, adjusted her collar, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The noise vanished instantly. No more chair scraping, no more chuckles, no ringtone music. 32 students in that room, each one with a story, each one with a defiance, turned their heads toward the door. Their eyes all locked onto Imani, filled with a range of emotions: boredom, disdain, suspicion, indifference. In the back row against the wall, 4 familiar faces stared at her like they already knew how this would play out. Logan Price, buzzed blonde hair, slouched back in his seat like a king ruling the tiny kingdom of 8C. He wore a worn leather jacket, muddy boots, and his stare was sharp as steel. Evan Green, holding his phone on the desk, still recording. His eyes darted constantly, capturing every flicker of the new teacher's face. Harley Vaughn, purple-dyed hair, long nails, neon highlighter, pretending to write something while smirking. And Noah Triggs, tall, quiet, leaning against the wall and staring without blinking, like a stone statue with iron eyes. Imani Bell didn't retreat. She walked up to the front like she was born to stand there. She set her bag down, turned around, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote just one thing on the board: Ms. Bell. The white chalk letters stood bold against the faded green board. No long introduction, no welcome speech, just a silent declaration. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. A few whispers rippled through the back of the room. Logan murmured something to Evan that made them both chuckle. Harley faked a big yawn, glanced at Noah as if inviting mischief. And Noah, as usual, didn't budge. Imani turned to face the class. She didn't say much. She just looked. Her eyes scanned each student as if reading an old book that was never boring. A black girl in the back lowered her eyes to her notebook. A skinny boy gazed out the window. A student with one earbud and secretly turned the volume down to hear better. This classroom, the place that had chewed up the patience of dozens of teachers, was now quietly asking, who will break her first? Imani Bell simply smiled. No challenge, no warning. But in her gaze, there was something that made Logan and the others uneasy. Something they weren't used to seeing in grown-ups. A stare that didn't flinch, didn't try to please, and wasn't afraid. She spoke for the first time in that room. Good morning. Today we start with a question, not about books, about people. Who here has ever been underestimated just because they look different? No one answered, but in the back of the room, one small hand slowly set down her pen. Her question echoed through the classroom, not meant to be answered immediately. It wasn't a trap, nor was it one of those emotional hooks used by inexperienced teachers trying to fill awkward silence. That question was more like a small mirror placed at the center of the room, for those brave enough to stop and look into it. No hands went up, no one replied. But in that very silence, Imani saw something she had witnessed far too often in other places. The kind of unspoken hesitation born from wounds that were never allowed to heal. The black girl sitting by the wall row lowered her head, pretending to write something, though her hand trembled slightly. Another black boy, skinny, thick glasses, tried to act like he didn't hear. Students like them, usually 3 or 4 in every class at every school she had taught, tended to have the same reaction when a teacher dared to touch the softest, most vulnerable part of the soul. Silence, withdrawal, pretending not to exist. They weren't slapped, nor were their names shouted on the chalkboard. They were slowly pushed to the margins of recognition. In the back row, Logan Price leaned back in his chair. He held a black pen in his left hand, scribbling lines onto the edge of his desk. His eyes weren't on the teacher. They were watching the class's reactions, reflected faintly in the overhead lights. Harley Vaughn, seated to his right, was absent-mindedly flipping her notebook. Her purple-dyed hair dangled over her face, but the smirk forming at the corner of her mouth peeked through. Beside her, Evan Green pretended to type on his tablet, though his gaze was locked onto Miss Bell like he was waiting to capture something. Logan lifted his pen, twirling it on the tip of his finger. No one spoke. No one responded to the question, but the silence wasn't empty. It was thick like morning fog, untouchable, yet cold, seeping into every corner of the mind. Ms. Bell turned her back calmly, opened the gradebook, and began jotting down names like it was any ordinary lesson. No one saw her hand shake. No one noticed her heartbeat racing faster than usual. But if you looked closely into her eyes, you'd catch a flash of caution, not because she feared the children before her, but because she was used to bracing herself every time she stepped into a room where people assumed she didn't belong. The lesson carried on in indifference. She began with the first topic in the language arts curriculum: setting and character in realist fiction. Phrases like conflict-driven narrative and symbolic opposition floated in the air like they weighed nothing. In the back, Jason pretended to doze off, phone resting in his lap, recording the classroom audio like some kind of private inside joke. Harley nudged Logan and pointed at Miss Bell's arm as she wrote on the board, her tone laced with that sneering sarcasm known only to those fluent in passive cruelty. Her skin's lighter than I expected. Good makeup, I guess. Logan smirked but didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a sheet of paper from his bag, crumpled it softly, then made eye contact with Evan. A slight chin nod sealed the pact. Evan nodded back, smirked, and began tapping at his smartwatch like checking the time. The watch didn't show the time. The screen was playing a dubbed sound effect, groaning pain, simulating a horror movie scream. The volume was low enough that only the first few rows could catch it clearly, but loud enough to distort the atmosphere. Ms. Bell heard it. She turned, said nothing. No scolding, no demand for quiet. She merely paused at the front, glanced at Evan's smartwatch, then resumed the lesson. This time she spoke about the difference between sound in literature and manufactured noise used by society to drown out the truth. She used those exact words, artificial noise to distract from meaning. No one protested, but several faces began to lose their mocking edge. She shifted the lecture into a discussion. What do you think is the boundary between personal expression and disrespect in a learning community? For the first time, the air in the room froze, not because of a prank, but because of a smart, strategic question. The class glanced at one another. Evan dropped his hand from the watch. Logan looked at Harley as if to ask, "What just happened?" The black students seated at the class's edges began to lift their eyes. They didn't speak, but their gazes now carried presence. Slight but noticeable. Just enough for a sharp-eyed teacher like Imani Bell to recognize. She stepped gently toward the center aisle, walking past the midsection of the class. No lectures, no steel stare discipline. She simply paused beside a student doodling a strange symbol on the desk. 3 diagonal lines and a dot, an insider mark of the Wolfpack crew. She gently placed her hand on the desk. What does this symbol mean? Is it something only the group understands? Evan twitched. Harley quietly closed her notebook. Logan cracked his knuckles, a subtle threat, loud enough to make a few students flinch. Imani didn't waver. She continued. In literature, symbols often represent power, resistance, or pain. But there are also symbols, placed in the wrong context, that become signs of the wrong kind of power. No one spoke, but everyone understood. She was talking about that very symbol, about that very misuse of power. From the back of the room, Logan sat up straighter, his voice full of sarcasm. So, are you here to teach us how to live, or is this just one of those model morality lectures? Imani Bell turned. No anger, no avoidance. She simply replied, I didn't come here to mother anyone. I came to help each of you rewrite your own story before someone else writes it for you. The answer was so brief it stunned the class. A moment of silence. No laughter, no pushback. The uninvited eyes, those that had arrived only to judge, for the first time, were no longer watching just to dismiss. In the corner of the room, Deshaun, the black student who rarely dared to raise his head, had lifted his chin. Wednesday morning at Hollow Creek High brought light rain, leaving the hallways damp and slick. The air in Wing A felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just the kind of cold that comes from a classroom where everyone is secretly waiting for something only a few actually know is about to happen. Imani Bell stepped through the door of room 8C at exactly 7:59, as she did every day, carrying her lesson bag, her white shirt crisply ironed, her skirt falling below the knee, her hair neatly pinned up. There was no tension on her face, but to eyes trained in spotting weakness from a glance, she was already marked. The teacher's desk had been wiped clean ahead of time. A water bottle sat waiting on the surface, unopened. A detail that might have passed for a rare act of kindness in a place that didn't believe in goodwill. But it wasn't an accident. Evan Green had arrived earlier than usual. Harley Vaughn had whispered something into Logan Price's ear, and the three exchanged silent looks. The late welcome had been carefully prepared, a prank not designed for laughs, but for humiliation. Imani entered, smiling and greeting the class as always. No one replied, but there was no laughter either, just a silence pulled taut like a wire. The tension in the room wasn't about the lesson. It came from something waiting to explode, like a firecracker hidden inside a clear plastic bottle. She set her bag down, twisted the bottle cap. In an instant, a fizzy brown liquid burst out violently, splattering her chest and sleeves. Not plain water, but a concoction of old soda, vinegar, and baking soda. A homemade chemical gag passed down among Hollow Creek students as the go-to formula for pranking teachers. Hissing, fizzing, then laughter, erupting from the back row like someone had just hit play on a comedy sketch. Evan raised his phone. Harley burst into fits, and Logan, unapologetically, laughed out loud, leaned back in his chair, and clapped 3 slow, deliberate times like he was applauding a finale. The whole class seemed to break into an odd, euphoric glee. A few students stared wide-eyed in surprise. The invisible kids in the back row looked down at their desks, as if it had been them getting sprayed with soda. On the whiteboard, faint under direct light, a line had been scribbled earlier with dry erase marker. "She's not one of us." Below it, the 3 diagonal slashes and 1 dot, Logan's group symbol, marked the message as their own, just like the ones secretly carved into desks all over the room. Imani Bell stood still. Her white shirt clung to her skin, soaked. Soda streaked her cheek, loosened her hair, and dripped from her chin onto her collar. She didn't scream, didn't yell, didn't cry. She just looked down at her hands, then slowly pulled a tissue from the drawer, dabbing each drop with calm precision. Evan raised his phone higher, zooming in. Harley muttered, "Her eyes'll go red in 3, 2, 1. But they didn't. She didn't look at them, didn't snap back. She simply breathed slowly, blotted her sleeves with the tissue, then stepped toward the board. With one hand, she erased the line, "She's not one of us." With the other, she wrote over it, "We all belong, even if we're not invited." The class fell silent. The prank, stripped of a dramatic reaction, lost its appeal. Logan rested his chin on his palm, eyes colder than usual, as if trying to figure out why the bait hadn't triggered the meltdown he expected. Imani turned, eyes fixed on Evan. "Are you live streaming?" she asked. Not loud, not accusing. Evan froze briefly. She continued, "Then let me help you get better footage." She stepped to the center of the front platform, not hiding the soaked fabric, not avoiding the lens, and said, "In classical literature, the ones being mocked are usually side characters, but in real life, they're themselves. And sometimes they're the ones who rewrite the ending." No one said a word. Imani stepped down, walking between the rows. With every step, droplets hit the floor. But her head stayed high. Her shirt stuck to her body. Her wet hair clung to her ears. She walked like it was a uniform, not a stain. Harley glanced at Logan and muttered, "She really didn't cry?" Logan furrowed his brow, unsure for the first time. In the back row, Deshaun, the black student who usually kept his head down, looked at his teacher like he had just witnessed something new. An adult who didn't give in, didn't fake it, didn't perform. Imani returned to the podium. Without calling for order, the class went quiet. She opened her lesson plan, as if the lesson was still going, and it was. "We're talking about the theme of characters society tries to erase. I think you just saw a live example." No one dared to laugh. Even Evan, still holding his phone, had lowered his hand. Third period on Friday morning unfolded under an atmosphere that wasn't exactly chaotic, but definitely not normal. The weather in Glendale was dry, with streaks of slanting sunlight slipping through the windows of room 8C, casting amber hues across the worn-out tiles. But inside the classroom, that sunlight was interrupted by a kind of invisible gloom. Not apathy, but a waiting game laced with something more bitter. A silent readiness to witness something collapse. And in this class, that meant watching to see how the new teacher would finally crack. Imani walked into class with the same calm demeanor, tidy, composed, and devoid of any air demanding authority. A pale olive coat, hair pinned neatly at the nape, simple flats, no overpowering perfume, no designer accessories, not even the little details teachers often bring to establish initial dominance. She walked to her desk and gently placed a small wooden box with a slit on top. On the lid, written in white chalk, were the words "voice box," a place to say what no one hears. No explanation, no introduction, no pitch. She simply placed it there. After a few brief roll call questions, she began the class with a short poem. "I laid the map of the world across my lap, traced the cracks with my finger, and whispered, 'Where does it hurt?' It answered, 'Everywhere.'" The line by Warson Shire was read in her low, steady tone, without dramatics, but with something that quietly compelled attention. A slight silence followed, then laughter bubbled up from the back. Logan smirked. Evan squinted. She quoting therapy memes now? A few others laughed. The kind of forced giggles that came more from peer pressure than humor. There was no pushback from Imani, no corrections. She simply turned to the board and wrote, "Perception versus." Reality today's topic was about how the world sees us versus who we really are. As she spoke about how society shapes value based on invisible criteria, a paper plane floated silently through the air, twirled a few times, and landed directly on her desk. White paper, clean folds, clearly intentional. No one claimed it. No one spoke up. But the suppressed giggles were back, not loud, but unmistakably complicit. She didn't touch it right away. Imani just looked at it, a steady, quiet look that seemed to drain some of the glee from the room. After a few seconds, she calmly opened the paper. Inside was a messy but unmistakable scrawl. "You don't belong here. You're not one of us. Just quit before we make you." This wasn't a childish prank. It was a warning, a threat, a calculated message. And then, something no one in the class saw coming happened. Imani didn't get angry. She didn't call out names. She didn't raise her voice, scold, or cite the rulebook. She didn't even throw the note away. She simply held it up, peacefully, and said in a completely level tone, "Thank you. This will be today's lesson." A ripple spread through the room. Logan straightened slightly, frowning. Evan leaned over and whispered with a confused frown, "Is she insane or something?" Imani turned back to the board, drew a line under perception versus reality, and added another sentence. "I once felt I didn't belong." She turned around, her eyes not commanding, but inviting. "Today's assignment, no grade, not mandatory, no names. I want each of you to write a short piece about a time in your life when you felt like you didn't belong. Could be at home, at school, among friends. Grammar doesn't matter. Handwriting doesn't matter. Just be honest." Harley was the first to burst out laughing, a loud, exaggerated laugh meant to stir the room. "Are you serious? This is English class, not group therapy." Imani smiled, not offended, not defensive. "I'm serious, but you don't have to do it. Just like whoever wrote this note chose to share what they saw as true, that I don't belong here. I respect that choice. Now I'm inviting you to do the same, but from the other side, share a time when you felt excluded." No one responded. Evan started rummaging through his bag for a pen, not to write, but to doodle out of habit. Logan folded his arms, unreadable, but something very small began to shift. At the back of the room, Deshaun Tucker, a skinny black student who rarely spoke, often had his head down and wrote slowly, pulled out a small scrap of paper. No one noticed except Imani. He wrote something, just a few lines, stood up silently, didn't ask permission, walked up to the front, and dropped it into the voice box. No one laughed. No one mocked him. The class seemed to freeze for a few seconds. Logan instinctively looked over, eyes skeptical, but for the first time said nothing. Harley blinked, glanced at Deshaun, then turned away. No one broke the moment. It was silent, not the combative silence of earlier classes, but the kind of silence that comes when no one knows quite how to respond. Imani didn't praise him, didn't say thank you or great job. She just watched him very quietly and then addressed the class. "Anyone else who wants to write can drop it in anytime, even after class. No need to sign, and I'll never ask who wrote what." When the bell rang for dismissal, there were no smug chuckles, no new stunts, just the soft sounds of chairs scooting, backpacks zipping, and a quiet sigh someone tried to hold in. Imani remained seated as if nothing memorable had happened, but the way her students looked at her had changed. Not full respect, not yet sympathy, but the beginning of a question. Evan stood up, glanced around like he was wondering, "Are we getting played here?" Logan walked out more slowly than usual, and strangely enough, didn't throw out a final jab like he typically did. Harley, the one who usually led the chorus of laughter, didn't laugh that day. She was the last to leave, pausing for half a second as she passed the voice box. She looked at it briefly, then walked on without a word. Amani remained seated, quiet, watching the sunlight slowly slide into the slit on the wooden box, like a beam trying to reach into something long locked away. By the following Tuesday, something had shifted again in classroom 8C. No one said it out loud, but nearly everyone could feel something building, like an invisible balloon waiting to burst, or a game that was about to reach its next move. And that's exactly what happened. Jason, not as loud as Logan, not as quick as Evan, not as flashy as Harley, was the one who walked into class that morning with a calculated smile. He wore Bluetooth earbuds and gave Imani a side glance, as if to say, "You ready for this?" Imani, as usual, greeted the class with her usual simplicity. "It's Tuesday. Anyone remember?" No one responded. She didn't look disappointed. She simply smiled, then wrote on the board, "What's real and what pretends to be?" No one paid much attention to the line. The students had gotten used to titles that sounded like TED Talk philosophy. But within minutes, the class slipped into an odd state. While Imani was lecturing, talking about how modern humans use sound to create shared emotional responses, a fairly abstract idea for 8th graders, Jason pressed something under his desk. A sound began to play, quiet but loud enough for nearby students to hear. It was a moan, not music, not engine noise, a fake moan, the kind of sound meant to trigger awkwardness, embarrassment, and shatter any serious tone. Evan burst out laughing first. Harley snorted, trying to suppress hers. Logan lifted his head, staring at Imani, curious to see how she'd react. The class began to giggle. Imani was silent for a few seconds. Not angry, not flustered, not offended. She simply walked toward Jason, not fast, not aggressive, then leaned slightly over his desk. She didn't confiscate the phone. She just asked, "Could you let me borrow that sound for a moment?" Jason blinked. That wasn't the reaction he expected. But with the whole class watching, he hit play again. The moaning noise echoed a bit louder this time. A few kids chuckled again. Imani nodded, then turned back to the board. "Thank you, Jason. That's exactly the example I needed for today's lesson." The room froze. Jason's smirk faded. Imani wrote 2 words on the board: real versus fake. Then she spoke slowly. "Do sounds have power?" "Yes, but not because of what they are, because of how we react to them." She turned to face the class. "A fake moan can make someone feel embarrassed. It can also make others curious or laugh. But the point is, it's fake. So why does something fake make real feelings show up?" No one answered. She went on. "In life, we're surrounded by things that sound real, but are designed to steer our emotions. Advertising jingles, laugh tracks in sitcoms, even notification tones on social media. If we can't tell the difference between authentic sound and manufactured noise, we're easier to manipulate than we realize." Logan blinked. Evan looked at Jason as if to say, "What the heck is she even saying?" Imani turned back to Jason, again without reprimand, and asked, "What do you think about the sound?" Jason hesitated. "It was just a joke, I guess." "I understand." Imani nodded. "I don't think joking is wrong. I'm just asking, if that sound played in a fancy restaurant or in a corporate boardroom, what would happen?" Jason didn't respond. She continued, "There's nothing wrong with humor, but when we use sound to control how others feel, we're playing with power. And I think Jason just gave the class a very clear example. We can use a tiny tool to shift the mood of the entire room. The question is, what will we use that tool for?" A long pause followed. For the first time, no one laughed after a prank. For the first time, Jason didn't feel like he'd scored points. For the first time, Harley didn't play along. Logan tilted his head. "So you're saying we're getting manipulated by laughter?" Imani responded gently. "No. I'm just saying, if you've never thought about that before, maybe today's the day to start." The class went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from fear of punishment, but the kind that comes when they realize they're no longer running the room like they thought. Jason put his phone away. No one asked him to, but he did, and no one patted his back or whistled to say, That was dope. The lesson continued, oddly enough, more smoothly than usual. Imani didn't need to assert control, didn't need to throw down, didn't need to silence anyone. And the most unsettling thing for those used to holding power was this. She never raised her voice. Not once. She just asked questions and made them flip those questions back on themselves. When the bell rang, Jason packed up faster than usual. But before stepping out the door, he paused and looked back at the board. The words were still there. REAL versus fake. Logan muttered, "Weird. She doesn't play by the rules we know." Harley walked beside him, saying nothing. But her eyes on Jason were different. Not mocking, not amused. Like something had crumbled or surfaced. Imani remained at her desk, calm, as if nothing noteworthy had happened. But that day the voice box had 3 new slips of paper. No one knew who they came from. But she knew one thing. The resistance had started to crack. Monday morning came gray, as if the weekend had never quite ended. Room 8C trickled to life with the soft shuffling of shoes across the tile floor, the crackle of a plastic bottle cap set down too hard. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed out loud. But every eye in the room had already locked on the teacher's desk, where something glaringly out of place sat in plain sight. A bright pink envelope, placed neatly on top of Miss Imani's lesson planner. It hadn't come through inter-office delivery, no postage stamp. It wasn't tucked in with administrative paperwork. Someone had walked in and left it there. And someone, perhaps everyone, was waiting to see how she would react. Imani entered at 7:42 a.m., sharp as always. White button-up blouse, charcoal gray blazer, low flats, no different from any other day. She paused for less than half a second as her eyes passed over the pink envelope, then continued on as if it didn't exist. But her hand touched it, just as the class grew louder, triggered by Jason high-fiving Logan. No one knew who had placed it there, but a few eyes darted away when she picked it up. Something about the air in the room felt unpleasant, as if everyone was standing on thin ice. Harley pulled out her phone, switched to vertical video mode, thumb hovering over the rec button. She didn't speak, just smirked as she tilted the camera toward the desk. Logan nudged Jason and whispered, "It's about to blow." Imani didn't rip the envelope open. She set it down, calmly sliced it open with a small letter knife, and pulled out a single sheet of decorative paper. Typed. No one could read it yet, but her eyes squinted slightly, then softened into their usual stillness. "We'll start with a short reading," she said, placing the sheet beside her and stepping to the front of the class. She held it up. "This is a letter addressed to me. I'm going to read it out loud because it's educational." The room froze. She began to read, steady and clear, each word pronounced with deliberate calm. "To Ms. Imani Brooks, we don't need another overpaid DEI experiment teaching our kids how to feel sorry for themselves. You think your poetry and your voice box makes you special? You're just a diversity hire playing therapist in a school that doesn't need fixing. From a white admirer." The room turned to stone. Someone audibly swallowed. Someone else gave a nervous chuckle, not yet understanding how serious this was. Harley moved the camera closer. Jason exhaled slowly, half anticipating, half bracing. Imani folded the letter. She scanned the room, then turned to Jason. Not with a smile, not with accusation, but with the look of someone who had seen this exact moment play out too many times before. She spoke gently. "Jason, your handwriting tilts left, and you always add a period after every exclamation mark, even when it's not grammatically necessary." The class stiffened. Jason turned red. Not the bashful red of mild embarrassment, but the flushed face of someone who had just been seen too clearly to deny it. The pen in his hand dropped to the floor with a dry clack. Imani didn't scold him, didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped back and asked, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, without malice or performance, "Why did you feel the need to write this?" Jason said nothing. Logan turned toward him, started to speak, then closed his mouth. Evan scratched at the desk with his fingernail. Harley lowered her phone, resting it on the desk. Her eyes flickered, not in shock, but in that stunned silence that comes when something lands sharper than expected. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. No one spoke for 30 seconds. Imani folded the letter again. She didn't tear it. She didn't throw it away. She placed it carefully in her desk drawer. Then she said, "And now we'll continue today's lesson about real voice and the right to exist fully." She turned slowly, as if listening to something only she could hear. She didn't rush to erase the board or dive into slides. Instead, she lifted her eyes to the class, not threatening, not pleading, just fully present. "How many of you," she asked softly, "have ever felt you had to say something cruel, just so no one would think you were weak?" No one answered, but Harley's eyes changed. The sarcasm was gone. So was the comfort of being the girl behind the camera. She placed the phone screen down on her desk. No recording, no shield. She rested her chin on her palm and looked at Imani, not through the lens of the sensitive teacher anymore, but through something closer, something raw. Jason stayed still, unmoving. His ears flushed red. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie like he was trying to escape the spotlight. But no one was really looking at him anymore. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that came from classroom rules. It was the kind that forced everyone to hear their own thoughts. Imani didn't return to the lesson plan. She asked one more question, so softly it was almost missed. If you knew someone was being forced to stay silent every day, what would you do differently? A few heads lowered. A few fingers started scribbling idly in notebooks. But no one laughed. No one pushed back. Most importantly, no one sighed with relief. After class, Harley didn't linger, but she walked slower than usual. In the hallway, she opened the recording she had made, watched it, and deleted it. No sharing, no drafts, no whispers to friends. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but because for the first time, she'd seen an adult silence a room not with shouting, but with something stronger. Back in Imani's desk drawer, the pink envelope remained, untorn, unhidden. And as she packed up for the day, she resealed it, writing a single line on the back. "We archive cruelty too, so we don't forget where dignity begins." That afternoon, as she left the school, a light rain began to fall. No one opened an umbrella, but something inside room 8C no longer felt dry or brittle. Outside, a small slip of paper, caught by the wind, tumbled down the hallway, face down. If someone had flipped it over, they would have seen 3 words scrawled in pencil. "I was wrong." Thursday afternoon, the classroom air felt like a guitar string pulled tight, on the verge of snapping. Imani stepped into 8C through a silence that didn't feel natural. She could sense it clearly. Something was about to detonate. Students sat straighter than usual. Their eyes, no longer indifferent, were watchful, braced. The echo of the anonymous pink envelope from Monday still lingered, and everyone knew, today someone was going to lose control. It didn't take more than 2 minutes. The fuse lit itself. Logan, the self-proclaimed new leader of the wolf pack, rose from his seat and marched to the center of the room. His eyes hardened. He slammed his palm on the desk. The sound cracked through the concrete like thunder. The class froze. "Enough of this," he shouted. "This class is chaos. People crying. No one learns anything. O truong nai, toijat luat." Imani didn't back up. She didn't blink. She just stood there, gaze sharp as a blade, without anger, without fear. She stepped forward slowly, just a few feet between them now. "Where I grew up," Imani said, her voice low but cutting through the room, "gunshots rang outside my window every night. Your rules don't make me flinch." A stunned silence gripped the room. Logan hadn't expected that. His jaw clenched. He looked toward his crew, Harley, Evan, Bryce, but none of them spoke. Imani remained motionless, steady. Logan turned to Malik, but Malik was looking down, lips pressed together, clearly wrestling with something inside. Logan scanned the room like a general looking for soldiers, but all he found were quiet faces, unsure eyes. And then, Noah, the original alpha wolf, who had never publicly taken sides. He looked at Logan, didn't speak, but gave the smallest nod toward Imani. Logan froze. It wasn't a nod of agreement. It was acknowledgement, a shift, a moment of reckoning. The class stared at Logan, waiting to see what he would do. But for the first time, Logan stood alone. No cheers, no loyal glances, just the ceiling fans spinning overhead and his own labored breathing. Imani didn't move closer. She didn't have to. She stood there like a mountain before the storm, unshaken, quiet. Logan took a step back, and in that moment, the room erupted, not in applause, not in noise, but in a silence that shouted louder than any cheer. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. Harley opened her phone, but not to film. She opened the Notes app, typed something silently. Malik exhaled and, for the first time, smiled. Evan gave Logan a light shoulder tap as he passed him on the way back to his seat, not as comfort, but as a quiet whisper. You can't scream your way into respect. Imani returned to her desk, placed her hand gently on the unopened lesson plan. But class had already begun, without a chalkboard, without a syllabus. In her mind, a door creaked open from the past. When she was 12, their apartment on South Side still had warped wooden windows. Every night, her mother would lift the mattress and prop it against the door. If you hear gunfire, just lie flat. Don't look outside. One night, as she worked on a math assignment, a bullet cracked through the wall and knocked over the only photo she had of her father. He'd died when Imani was small. That bullet didn't kill anyone, but it taught her something. Fear is not something worth feeding. She looked at Logan. That face wasn't fierce anymore, just lost. He said nothing, walked back to his seat through a suffocating quiet. In his mind, flashes. Times he was cheered for mocking others. The Wolfpack chat, full of fake laugh emojis. The power he felt strutting into class like a king. But today, the throne had crumbled, and no one even tried to fix it. Harley glanced between Logan and Imani, and for the first time, the idea of rules they had crafted, it felt hollow. She opened her phone again and typed a single sentence. Rules should protect the weak, not target them. At the back of the room, Malik and Evan whispered, not taunts this time, but reflections. Evan murmured, my dad got shot once. Mistaken identity. I know that sound. Malik just nodded. Without instruction, the class began to shift into a space of dialogue. No disruptions, no hidden cameras. Students looked at one another, not as roles, not as performers, but as people. Imani didn't smile in victory. She calmly walked to the board, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote in large letters, who really makes the rules and why? She turned around. Her eyes didn't demand, but invited. Write your answer on paper. Just one sentence, and don't let anyone else speak for you. Pens began moving. Noah sat still. He didn't write, but his chin rested on his hand, his gaze fixed on the wooden flute Imani had placed on the desk days ago. He wasn't easily moved, but something had begun to stir, and Logan sat there, gripping the edge of his desk, his face still flushed, but he didn't dare look up. The lesson that day wasn't in any textbook, but everyone knew. It would follow them for years. Friday morning, the light spilled across classroom 312 like a gentle oil slick, subtle, soft, and spreading. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Something had broken, and in its place a strange silence had settled. Not oppressive, not empty, just peaceful. As the wall clock struck 8 o'clock, Imani stepped in, holding a slim stack of lesson plans, face bare of makeup, yet her eyes carried a brightness that made the room, almost instinctively, straighten its posture. No one whistled, no one fake yawned, no one snickered. For the first time all year, class began on time, without a single command. Harley sat in the front row, quietly unlocking her phone. Her thumb hovered over the folder labeled Classroom Chaos, a collection of teacher prank clips she had curated like a private trophy case. She scrolled to the clip from earlier in the week, Logan yelling, Imani standing firm, Noah nodding. Then, she tapped delete. No hesitation. In the second row, Jason opened his phone too. He was known for his hidden camera troll clips stashed in an old backpack compartment. But today, when he saw the recording of the fake moan he'd played just days earlier, he bit his lip, then deleted it. No one asked him to. It just didn't feel funny anymore. Noah, the one whose face rarely revealed a thought, put his pen down. His eyes found the wooden flute still resting on Imani's desk. Yesterday, the way she'd set it down wasn't to teach music. It was a reminder, Some sounds don't come from mouths, but from silence. And that was the first lesson Noah hadn't written down, but had etched into memory. Logan arrived 10 minutes late. The classroom door swung open. He walked in without asking, without swagger, without that signature chin tilt. He dropped into his seat with a heaviness that turned no heads. And that, more than confrontation, was what suffocated him. The indifference. Imani was in the middle of a lecture on To Kill a Mockingbird, specifically the part about Tom Robinson, the black man falsely accused. But she wasn't lecturing from theory. She asked one question. If you were in that courtroom, what would you think seeing Tom there? No one answered right away. The silence wasn't from laziness, but deep thought. Then a hand rose, from the last row. Malik. Imani gave a small nod. Malik stood. His voice trembled, but held. I think this is the first time I really understand how Tom felt. Like you didn't do anything wrong, but people already decided you were guilty. Because of your skin. Because you don't look like them. No laughter. No whispers. Jason looked at Malik, eyebrows knit, as if seeing someone he thought he knew, for the first time. Bryce glanced toward Harley, but said nothing. Imani didn't shower Malik with praise. She didn't analyze or echo. She just smiled. A smile so faint it felt like wind. But that smile made the class exhale. It was permission. Permission to be honest. Permission to change. Another hand rose. Anna, the Mexican-American girl often nicknamed Taco Girl by the Wolfpack. She spoke without fear. I think we have a lot of Tom Robinsons in this class, but nobody ever asked how they feel. Imani smiled again. The white classroom walls, once covered in scribbled whiteout phrases, were beginning to clear, not with erasers, but with words like those. Logan looked around. For the first time, no one looked to him for a reaction. Harley didn't glance for approval. Jason didn't wink. Even Noah stayed focused on Malik. And that, more than opposition, was what Logan had never experienced. Being left behind. Not because anyone said he was wrong, but because they no longer cared what he thought. He wanted to say something. He wanted to yell, but he had nothing to yell. Harley turned to Imani and asked, So, how do you know if you're carrying prejudice and don't realize it? Imani responded. Not with a smile this time, but with clarity. When you ask that question, the prejudice has already started to crack. A student in the middle, Olivia, pressed her palm to her chest. She had never spoken in class, but today she scribbled into her notebook. I used to laugh when Anna got called Taco. I don't laugh anymore. No one told her to write that, but in a room that had once been a stage for cruel comedy, the script was being rewritten. Logan bit his lip. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a voice clip, a recording of a Manny he had planned to manipulate into a mocking edit. His finger hovered over delete. He didn't press it, but he didn't play it either. He just stared at the screen, and for the first time wondered, if I'm not the one being cheered, who am I? At the front, Imani closed her lesson book. She didn't need to flip to the next page, because today, the lesson wasn't in the curriculum. The class, for the first time, was teaching itself. And the most remarkable part? No one remembered to laugh, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is know when not to. Monday morning. Cold wind swept through the hallway like a quiet punctuation mark. Room 312 was unchanged. White walls, blackboard, uneven wooden desks, and the same wooden flute still resting on Imani's desk. But something had shifted, and the clearest change was in the way people looked at one another. Not like they were clinging to roles, but like they were waiting to see who would lay theirs down first. Logan walked in earlier than usual, not to claim a seat, not to perform. He just hadn't been able to sleep. All night he'd stared at the ceiling, thinking about that moment the week before, when no one had looked his way. That feeling, quiet but sharper than any insult, had stuck. He had planned to say something the moment he entered. But when Imani walked in, her eyes paused gently on each face, not to judge, just listening for words that hadn't been spoken yet. Logan stayed quiet. His palms were sweating. He stared at the board, blank, and then, like he couldn't hold it any longer, he stood. I'm sorry, The words dropped into the room like a stone in still water. No one reacted at first. Bryce tilted his head slightly. Jason blinked rapidly. Harley froze mid-click, her pen still capped. "I'm sorry," Logan repeated louder this time. "Not because anyone told me to say it, but because I think I really was wrong." Imani didn't answer. She tilted her head, her eyes neither condemning nor encouraging, just present, allowing him to go on. "I laughed when I shouldn't have. I let my opinion drown out other people's voices. I used to think power meant making people shut up. But now I think, maybe real power is knowing when to shut up and actually listen." Logan swallowed. "I'm not asking to be forgiven. I just think, if I don't say this today, then everything good this class has started to become will get stuck because of my silence." Imani stepped closer to the desk but still didn't interrupt. Logan looked around the room. "Noah, I looked down on you because you don't talk much. Malik, I called you a name I shouldn't even repeat. Anna, I laughed when people called you Taco. I don't think it's funny anymore." The room froze, not stiff with fear, but in that fragile pause when something old is breaking. Olivia covered her mouth. Jason lowered his eyes. Bryce stood, placed a hand on Logan's shoulder. Said nothing, but it was enough. Imani smiled. Not the smile of victory, the smile of someone watching what she planted bloom without having to water it anymore. Harley looked at Logan, not with sarcasm, not with superiority, but quiet respect. The class stayed silent for a few more seconds. Then Imani finally spoke. "We won't clap, because this isn't a performance. This is an apology, and we'll let it live quietly inside us." The whole room nodded, and for the first time, an apology wasn't questioned, mocked, or weaponized. It was simply accepted, as part of something growing inside each person. The lesson continued, but something had changed. Not because Imani taught differently, but because the class listened differently. As she read a passage about Atticus Finch standing for justice in a courtroom soaked in prejudice, Malik's eyes never left the page. Jason, for the first time, didn't just take notes for the test. He wrote down questions he didn't yet know he had. Logan sat quietly, but it wasn't the silence of a former ruler sulking. It was the silence of someone relearning, from the ground up, what it means to have dignity. Harley went home that day and didn't open TikTok, didn't post. She lay on her bed, reopened old essays, ones where she once wrote about the right to be different, but hadn't lived that truth. She started rewriting, not for a grade, but because something inside her wanted to change too. Meanwhile, Imani stayed in the classroom a little longer. She opened her notebook and scribbled a line quickly. "They're beginning to listen, not because I speak well, but because they want to hear." That's the real miracle. As the last light of the day streamed through the window, catching the wood grain of the flute, Imani picked it up. She didn't play it. She just looked at it. A student walked past the open door, paused, and asked, "Aren't you going to teach something else today?" Imani turned and smiled. "I think today you all just taught yourselves something more important than anything I had planned." The student nodded, walked on. The door closed gently behind him, leaving a quiet in the room, not cold, not hollow, but the kind of quiet like soil, ready for something to grow. And somewhere in the hallway, someone, no one knows who, hummed a simple melody, wordless, but enough for others to hear it and know something in that classroom had truly finally changed. Friday morning, the rare winter sunlight filtered through the classroom windows, casting a soft gold glow across the faded dry erase marks still lingering on the whiteboard. But Imani didn't write anything there today. Instead, she sat at her desk, the wooden flute beside her like a quiet emblem. On the students' desks, notebooks were already open, but no one was writing. They weren't waiting for a lesson. They were waiting for a space safe enough to speak the truth. Imani tapped lightly on her desk. "Today, we're not learning from the textbook. We're learning from each other. Has anyone here ever felt treated differently because of your skin, your voice, your hair, or simply because you didn't look like everyone else?" The room held its breath. Then a hand slowly rose. Layla, the Jamaican girl with waist-length braids often mocked behind her back as a bird's nest, stood up. One time in gym, Layla began, someone said, "I bet she never washes her hair." I laughed it off, but that night I cried. I wished my hair was straight. I wished I looked like everyone else. But now I don't wish that anymore. The room was still. Jason stared down at his desk. Logan turned his face away. Next was Deshaun. Quiet as always, but today he stood, his voice soft but firm. Every class I walk into, I get that look, like I'm going to cause trouble. I don't do anything, but people are already ready for me to mess up. Every time we have to pair up, I'm the last one. Like I'm a risk, not a classmate. Imani nodded. No interrupting, no guiding. She let the room teach itself. Then Harley stood. Her eyes red, her expression caught somewhere between brave and barely holding it together. I used to judge people for their hair, the way they talked, their grades, their shoes. I thought doing that made me a winner. But I realized I hated myself more than anyone else. She paused. "I'm sorry," she said, then sat down. She didn't ask to be forgiven, but she was. In the quiet glance Layla offered, in the nod Deshaun gave, in the silent understanding shared by Logan, Bryce, and even Jason. Imani didn't label it brave. She didn't call it growth. She just smiled, the way a gardener does when the soil softens after fire. As class neared its end, no one checked the clock. Stories kept coming, not accusations but memories. Wounds once powdered over, now finally seeing air. Malik spoke of being scolded for dozing off in class, though no one knew he'd worked at a fast food job until 1 a.m. Olivia admitted she once considered applying for a scholarship, but gave up because, "My name doesn't sound like much." Anna gave a bitter laugh as she recounted how every time she raised her hand, someone would joke that she's only good at Spanish. "You once said we don't learn from books, but from each other," Bryce said. "Today I get it. Every story, it's like a chapter I never had the guts to open." Imani stayed quiet, because sometimes the power of a teacher lies not in speaking, but in creating the space for others to be heard. The wooden flute still sat quietly on her desk, but no one needed to play it. The classroom itself had become music, a symphony of heartbeats, quiet exhales, and pens rewriting the past with truth. Just before the bell, Harley stood again. Her voice trembled slightly. "I don't know how much I can change, but if anyone in this room ever needs someone to listen, I'm here." Imani walked to the board and wrote 3 words. "Listening builds bridges." Then she turned around and said, "Thank you for building one today, starting right here, where there used to be a crack." And when the bell rang, no one rushed to leave. They stood, moved slowly, tapped shoulders gently, without needing to say much. Something invisible, yet real, had been laid down on the classroom floor. Maybe no one outside of room 312 would know what happened that day, but for those who were there, it wasn't just another lesson. It was the beginning of a different kind of class, a class in empathy. A breeze brushed through the hallway. On the desk, the wooden flute tilted slightly, as if bowing to the students who had just grown a little taller in kindness. On the first Monday of the week, at the center of Skyview School's main hallway, a plain white poster appeared on the bulletin board. In italicized black letters it read, "Special Guest Doctor. Elijah Banks, former student, speaker, education activist, returns to share. Silence is not neutrality." No pictures, no flashy bio. But the name alone stirred the entire hallway. That name wasn't unfamiliar to the students who had once sat in Imani's classroom. Dr. Banks used to attend Skyview, and he was once suspended for writing an essay that questioned the school board's discriminatory process in selecting student leadership. 20 years later, he returned, not as someone forgotten, but as someone who lights the way. The talk was held in the main auditorium. Seats filled quickly. Imani sat in the front row with several other teachers. Logan, after publicly apologizing the week before, quietly chose a seat near the middle, hugging his backpack, not saying a word. Jason didn't fidget with his phone like usual. Malcolm, who had never volunteered to speak in class, sat in the front row, eyes locked in. Dr. Banks arrived on time. No music, no colored lights, just a tall, composed figure in a charcoal suit, holding a worn leather notebook. His voice was low and resonant, enough to still the entire auditorium. I once sat in room 312, he began without theatrics. That was the place where my friend was called the Black Romeo, just for daring to write a love poem to a white girl. Where I was once locked inside the sports equipment room by 3 classmates because I spoke up too much in history class. He paused. His eyes scanned the rows of students holding their breath. I stayed silent for 3 years. I thought silence was survival. Until one day I heard an old teacher say, "History is not written by those who nod." And I started speaking out. I got suspended. I got threats, but I didn't back down. Some students exchanged glances. Bryce whispered just loud enough for Logan to hear. "Sounds like our class." Dr. Banks didn't need a microphone. His voice carried, clear, unwavering. "I didn't come back here to brag. I came back to ask, if you see injustice, will you choose silence? Or will you choose to do something, even the smallest thing, to change it?" When the Q&A session began, no one expected the first raised hand to be Jason's. He stood up, eyes not meeting the stage. "When you were insulted, isolated, did you ever want to get back at them? For revenge, I mean?" Dr. Banks looked directly at Jason, as if seeing a younger version of himself. "Of course I did, many times. But I realized revenge is a fire that burns you first. I didn't overcome the urge. I redirected it. I used it to teach, to write books, to create space for students like you to be fully yourselves." Pen tapping stopped. Whispering ceased. Every gaze turned toward the stage. Logan raised his hand. He stood with slight hesitation, but his eyes were steady. "What if someone once looked down on classmates, mocked them, thought they were better? Can they make it right? Or will people always see them as the bad guy?" Dr. Banks nodded, his tone softening. "I believe in change, but real change doesn't begin with saying sorry. It begins with living differently, consistently. The wrong doesn't disappear, but it can sit beside kindness if the person is brave enough." Malcolm, the boy who once lived in Logan's shadow, raised his hand for the first time in a packed auditorium. "How? Do you start?" Dr. Banks stepped down from the stage, ignoring his notes. He gently placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "You start by admitting you were wrong, by listening more than you speak, and by remembering, no one changes the system alone, but anyone can change the air around them." The auditorium was utterly still, not out of fear, but reflection. When the talk ended, there was no awkward applause like in other assemblies. This time the clapping was steady and real. No one stood up right away. They just sat, nodding, like seeds soaking in their first rain after a long drought. That afternoon, room 312 gathered again. No teacher, no instructions. Bryce brought out a paper with a messy sketch of the words. "We weren't born to be silent." Harley suggested, "What if we start a discussion group? Not just talk, but do writing sessions, share experiences?" Jason nodded. Logan didn't argue. Layla grabbed markers and wrote the first words on the whiteboard. "Diversity voices, the club for every voice." Ms. Imani walked past the room without entering, but through the cracked door she saw something sprouting, not from a lesson plan, not from pressure, but from the strength of students who once thought they were just background characters. In the main hallway, just below the poster for next month's basketball game, a small sheet of paper was taped with clear Scotch tape. The handwriting was uneven, but the message was firm. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is siding with the wrong. March at Hollow Creek didn't bring much change in weather, but the third-floor hallway, where room 312 sat among the old classrooms, suddenly felt noticeably different. No one announced it. There were no speeches, but if you had walked through there at the beginning of the year, you'd notice it instantly. No more mocking laughter, no more phones sneakily recording videos to turn into memes, no more sideways glances meant to provoke or crush someone. What you'd hear instead were the soft scrapes of chairs as students stood to speak, books marked with sticky notes, and the quiet tapping of hands on desks when one student read a poem and another responded in silent agreement. Imani entered the classroom as she always did. No one jumped up robotically to greet her, but nearly everyone looked up and nodded, not at a figure of authority, but at someone they now saw as a guide. She never started class with, "Take out your books." Instead that morning, she simply asked, "If today we had the chance to rewrite an old chapter, what would you write?" No one needed prompting. Jason, the one who had once played fake moaning sounds in class, was the first to raise his hand. "I'd rewrite the day I thought my joke was clever. Now I realize it only reflected my fear of learning and lack of patience." Imani didn't praise him. She just wrote one word on the board: growth. Harley was no longer the one who stirred the crowd. She now led the discussion group. When they shared thoughts on To Kill a Mockingbird, Harley posed a question. If justice were a character in the story, could that character die? And if so, who's responsible for bringing it back to life? The room wasn't heavy. It was open. No one laughed when Logan stayed quiet for a while before speaking up. Maybe justice never dies. It just gets lost and needs someone to bring it back. That answer made a few students glance at each other, surprised. It was Logan, the same boy who once declared, "This school runs by my rules." Jason began turning in his assignments on time, properly formatted, always adding a note at the end. "I'm not sure if I got it right, but I tried." Layla helped Harley edit the layout for the class newsletter. Bryce used his break time to guide Malcolm in making posters for diversity voices. And Logan, the one who shocked Imani the most, no longer showed change through words. He did things he once thought were pointless: picking up papers for others, correcting grammar in an international student's essay named Kareem, and, during one class, when a black student was mocked for how he pronounced peculiar, Logan didn't look away. He said clearly, "He said it right. We're just used to hearing one kind of accent." No one in the class said a word, but the way they looked at Logan changed, and the boy, who never spoke more than 3 words an hour, emailed Imani that evening. "Today, I felt like I was really part of this class. For the first time." Imani didn't reply right away. She just stared at the email, then saved it into a folder titled Future. At the final staff meeting of the term, Hollow Creek's principal, Ms. Marlene O'Connor, walked up to Imani near the end of the session. She didn't say much, just held Imani's hand for a moment and smiled. "They say you're the first to tame 8C, but truth is, you did more than that. You made them choose kindness, not through fear, but through being heard." Imani didn't answer, but when she returned to class, she wrote this line on the board to close out the school year. "You can't teach kindness, but you can create a space where it grows." You've just followed the story of a classroom once infamous for chaos, where kind words used to be swallowed by mocking laughter and the silence of the majority. And yet, with just one person, a teacher who didn't shout, didn't demand obedience, that entire system began to shake, not through discipline, but through timely questions, through a belief that even the bullies were once abandoned themselves. And in the end, the change didn't come from power. It came from small but courageous choices: placing a hand on someone's shoulder, raising a hand to apologize in front of a room full of people, or simply not laughing with the crowd. If you've ever been Imani, the one who plants seeds in a storm, or if you've ever been Logan, Jason, or Harley, the ones brave enough to look at themselves and begin again, then this story was meant for you. What do you think truly changes a classroom? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because your words might be exactly what someone out there needs to hear to believe again. And if you believe that kindness can spread like fire, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who's quietly trying to do the right thing. We don't just tell stories, we redraw justice, one classroom at a time.